Yes, indeed. I was going to ask for that. Thank you, and great to see many people here. We continue our rounds of improvisation a little bit because this session was originally compiled by Brian, Detlef, and me, mostly just writing along and sometimes chiming in. And with Brian not being here, we can see whether there is any opportunities for him to chime in remotely and help out with the chairing and comment on the session, and make himself known to the technician with the Zoom in the back in the chat there, so that we know when to switch to him. We have organized this session in three little clusters, with the order a little bit different actually from what's here on the slide. But we will start with Carol Green first to continue on the presentation that you've seen from her yesterday in the plenary session on the literature database, and now a bit more on the methodologies behind it. Then we will have two presentations after discussion with Carol. We'll have the presentation from Vanessa Schweitzer on limits to adaptation and baseline scenarios for IEV, and then Claudia Tebaldi on climate impacts in baseline scenarios, and have discussion about those two. And then have the other cluster of Nicolas Chirac, which I'm not sure actually is here or is somewhere online or not. It's one of those speakers that's been ghosting us. And Jennifer Morris, who is online and will present her own presentation on guiding future research for scenario development. No, wait. For pressures and trends. So, yeah, it's too bad if we would miss the devil scenarios from Chirac, but yeah. But if we don't get responses, then it's hard to drag a speaker in if they're not here. Good, so let's start with Carol on the literature database. And put up here, please. Yeah, sure. This here.
Thank you. Perfect.
So there it comes. You can move it forward.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you all. It's great to be back in front of a smaller crowd and give a bit more detail as to what was going on behind the literature database development and some of the methods as well. So as I said previously, this is the second iteration of the literature database, which is a compilation of literature from 2020 to 2021 of all literature using SSPs. And so we'll dive in a bit more. Some of the reasons as to why this was done was seen from the first scenarios forum, but was also just for two separate reasons we can branch it into, for analysis and then also to enable future research. And so under the analysis component, we see that documenting literature gives us sort of an overarching view as to what's happening and how authors are using SSPs. And since we're not looking at specific extensions or other areas, we can take this broad generalized view as to how they're being used, which is really helpful. And then additionally, future research, we think that this can be really helpful for researchers, especially those who are new to the field, to really find what's already been published around SSPs, what areas need to be expanded upon, to do further research, and help inform some of the future research as well. And it's an exciting thing to see sort of overall trends that we can look at with that. So that's, the summary of why. Now here's some of the methods. There's some much more detailed methods that you can read if you want to read into each little category. But the overall publication date, like I said, All of the literature was published from 2020 to 2021, so key that none of it is 2022. Sorry to all of you with new papers out. And then our sources, so in the first literature database, we really just grabbed from Google Scholar. I did a really extensive grab from there. With this one, we found some limits on what we could grab, and so we expanded into other databases as well. In total, we have 8 databases. Now I feel like I'm counting wrong. 8 additional databases. And the search terminology that we used was shared socioeconomic pathways. And this is a little bit key. Some people pushed to just say SSPs. We were finding in the first version that that wasn't capturing additional papers. It was actually capturing other things like species and random things. So not worth our time, we decided. So we kept it really to doing, and there's 4 terms within this: shared socio-economic or shared socioeconomic pathways with the S or not. This process was 5 coders, approximately 2,600 hours of work. It's probably been more. This was estimated a month ago. So, and each paper, so papers were grabbed from these databases, and then we went through and said, are they using the SSPs? Not just saying this other publication did and we liked it. That's great, but that's not what we're counting. And so going through, of note is that we did use papers that are using population data significantly as part of their analysis or GDP data. And then they were tagged along pre-selected tags based off of SSP. Was it an SSP development paper, narrative, extension, study types, applications, RCPs and SSP pairings, geographies, regions, etc. Some of what we already saw in the my earlier talk. So, and in total, there's approximately 1,550. I think this is actually 1,570 now that we've done a bit more. And then 1,133 of these are published in the preliminary database. Some of the changes from the previous database, a lot of things were added, some things were removed. So we didn't remove extensions as a category as a whole, but there was a previous breakdown of which extensions, what type of extensions. And we are finding that that wasn't necessarily as useful as we had hoped. And so that's still possible work. It still could be done to then look at what we tagged as extensions and say what extensions they were. And then elements used, so that refers to whether it was GDP or population or anything else. And then IAM elements used. We were finding that that was very complex to communicate to coders, and so it wasn't necessarily helpful in the ways in which we were expecting. And then we added time horizons, geographies, regions, data availability, and some of the other key tags within the applications broadly we added as well, which I can go through. And climate projections, that was also added. And so here's the, ta-da, the final preliminary version, not final, the preliminary version of the database that's now been published on CDOC's website. And so you can now use it. Wonderful if you have any sort of analyses that it'd be helpful for. And there will be a finalized version likely later this summer. As you saw, about 400 papers left to go, but for us that's not that much, so we're excited. All right, and then as you saw previously, and I'll go quickly through these slides because I want to have time to discuss, but we do see a growing number of publications. Somewhat unfortunately, we do see also a growing number of publications where there's only one SSP used, which is, not ideal for the framework, but of note. And then these SSP applications, so like I commented in the earlier session, this excludes when we use climate projections as an application, but that is because it was normally multiple, which is different to the first version of this literature database where you could only select one application. Here you can select multiple. So some of them are overlapping, but we really push to try and do only one application where needed. And so I'll comment briefly on just that we do see really this focus on emissions, land use, ecosystems, and water hazards is sort of the overarching. That's everything but the blue and purple. And then some of the more closely related to human interactions is in the blue. And so that's of impact just because I think that will come into play in the future as well. And SDGs in purple, importantly. Okay, and then if we look by regions, you've also already seen this, but we can see that small island developing nations is the smallest, followed by Australia, New Zealand, then Central and South America in the gray. And then as we go, you can't see very well, but this is global, which is somewhat anticipated, obviously. And then Asia, which is next. I think this is primarily driven by extensions. And then Europe followed, and then North America, Africa are tied. And then here we look at geographic focus. This wasn't highlighted earlier. Again, sorry, this is a little hard to see. But you can see that up here we have oceans and then forests, polar regions. So primarily we're looking at oceans, river deltas, and urban. And then, well, polar regions is closely followed by that. So the least looked at was deserts and some of the rural areas as well. I thought that it was particularly interesting that coast is not larger than it is right now. And then the interesting slide. So this one is looking at SSP and RCP pairings. Of note, on this one, I did not compile the total. I believe I'm not seeing the my next slide, but we don't have the totals just of SSPs down at this bottom bar. Here, I can put it with my finger. This bottom bar is looking at SSPs that are paired with RCPs. So this is not including papers that just use SSPs, which is different to what I showed earlier. And then this over here includes when it's scenario maps versus when it's not. And so the weightings look a little different on this one. But we do have some of the numbers here as well. And you can see some of the weightings as well, where we do see that there's significant use of SSP2 with RCP 2.6, as well as SSP4 with 6. But then if we look by the scenario map pairings, you really take a look at the scale because it's very different to what we're looking at when we look at just SSP and RCP pairings. And so here we see a lot more people are using those scenario map pairings. Yes, so next steps. So that was an overview. Apologies, but we can jump back if we have any questions or comments. But the next steps for this is really overall expanding the use of SSPs, particularly if we look at geographic focuses and if we look at sort of the pairings that are being made. And with that comes, I think, increased clarity and communications around the SSP framework and around SSP modeling. I really think oftentimes of new modelers who aren't as invested in this community, and I think it's important to communicate clearly what's being done and also what they can do, which is really important. And then intentionally really aiming for policy applications as well, which was part of the first recommendations from the first scenarios forum, and I think continues today. And then continue methods for analyzing and recording the literature. And that's more of this project of what will it look like with expanding publications, how do we best want to address really looking at the literature well, and is it best to keep doing a method like this, or is it best to really do another method of really analyzing what's going on? So thank you to my coding team again, they're fantastic, and yeah, take a look at their bios and everything. They're wonderful. And then to all of the wonderful authors with me and all of the teams that have worked with me, thank you. So, thank you all.
Yeah, and thanks a lot to you for coordinating this. No, you were good.
Okay, great.
So you're heading to the end, so I didn't give you the warning.
Oh, good.
Any questions to Carol?
I'm going to stay up here just so we can see slides.
Yeah, that's easier.
Hi, thanks. No, this is great. It was just a clarification. The version 1 and version 2, would it be sort of homogenized so that you can do analysis using both of them? That wasn't clear because that's longer, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, so we really did try to keep a lot of things the same. So applications of SSPs are almost all the same apart from climate modeling, which, like I said, is overlapping. So it's not, you can still make a lot of those comparisons. And then RCP pairings, those are all the same. The only things that changed were really looking at additional factors. And so some of those things you can't compare necessarily across version 1, like regions and geographies and things like that. And that could be an additional project. It was just beyond the bandwidth for this project to really expand it too much more. So,
sorry to hijack just one last. But are you thinking also to automatize a bit, like using, I don't know, machine learning learning or something as you go on?
That has been the question of the week for me, so thank you. No, that's great. I think it would be wonderful. It's, it's a complex project, and so it could be great. I'm not an expert in machine learning, so I'd have to pull in some other people and see how that works. But yeah, thank you.
So hi, Alex from PIC. Just very briefly, first of all, thanks. I think it's really nice effort. But do you know from version 1 who were the main users of it in the end?
Yeah, so that's, and some of that's managed more by CDEC. It does seem like a lot of users were modelers, which is great. And so I don't have the end numbers on me, but I could get them and look more in detail into that. So I think mostly academia. And that is a pro and con, I think, of this, is I think that it's more targeted towards academic audiences. Most people don't regularly look into SSP and RC pairings, but yeah.
Yeah, Simona from Bauer University. It was very interesting. We're doing something similar, as we all know. I think it was interesting to see the use of one SSP or two SSPs. I was wondering if there was a reason not to check the other SSP pairings, or if it's work in progress. So, like,
one SSP and two.
Yeah, so in the presentation you showed that you checked the studies that used one SSP or two SSPs, right?
We checked for more.
All of them.
One or more, sorry.
Yeah, so this is for, and do you have an insight on whether there's a majority of studies that focus on MIPS, on the ones that used only one SSP?
Oh, like one scenario MIPS.
Yeah.
Oh, I have not looked at that. That's possible. Yeah, and so we could grab the papers that only use one and then look at whether or not they're using scenario MIPS. Yeah. Thank you for that. Good idea.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering about that myself as well, because you have on the one hand the majority of papers now being used for impacts, and not so many more for mitigation. But it's mostly mitigation studies that focus on the single SSP traditionally.
And to be clear, I'm going to go back to our application. So when I was presenting in the first session, I looked at the different study types. And when the first breakdown that happened in the first scenarios form, they also broke it down by study types. But that was actually looking at applications and saying which applications are mitigation themed, adaptation themed. And so that's actually more of a breakdown of this chart, and not a breakdown of, we separately tagged papers and said, are they solely focused on adaptation? Are they solely focused on mitigation? And that's where you see fewer papers. And so it looks more extremely like there was going towards impacts. But I think that will be an edit towards the paper, is to make sure that it's clear that that's not necessarily true from version 1 to version 2. That's one of those additional types that we added. So I hope that clarifies. But yeah.
I see a few more hands here. And also, Brian, online, make yourself known in the chat to the technician if you want to ask a question.
Ted Shepard, University of Reading. Is it possible, or have you looked for why people would choose particular scenarios, especially if they only chose one?
Yeah, I think so. Some of the side work that I'm interested in is we've also grabbed papers that have not used SSPs and say explicitly why. And some of that loops in as well, if we can sort of point to when people feel that scenarios don't match up perfectly with what they're looking at. And so some of it, I think, is just purely that. But we haven't written down reasons as to why people chose specific ones. But that, I think, would be possible to say, let's look at all the emissions papers and say which ones are they using. And so we really could easily break that down as well. There's a lot of fun things that I think you could do with this. Yes.
Okay, I'm Henrik Karlsson, Stockholm Environment Institute, and part of Simona's team regarding this paper. I was wondering if people select, for example, 3 scenarios out of 5.
Yeah.
You can do that in many different ways, of course, perhaps 10 different ways, if I do the calculations correctly. Did you check for different combinatorial combinations when people selected less than 5 scenarios?
No, is the short answer. We just made sure to grab the different pairings along those lines. And so we really didn't limit what papers could do, but just instead instead grabbed the pairings, but we didn't make any sort of comparisons between what that's looking at. And so honestly, I think for me, the hope is that if anybody's interested in these things, take it and do this, because I think that there's a lot. And so obviously not before I publish my paper, so give it time. But yes, that's the goal.
Don't be too fast.
Yeah.
See, we have a question online behind you.
Hi, Brian.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Well, Carol, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
I bet that you thought you had left giant lit reviews like this behind when you left Denver.
Yes.
But it's great that you took this up again. Thanks for doing it. It looks great. I guess my question is, like you say, there's lots of things that one could do to look further at the results in various ways, especially now looking at shifts over time, right? Because there's a longer time series now, thanks to you and your team. And so I think that would be interesting in looking at, besides shifts in total numbers of publications over time, shifts in the other things you're looking at. So has the distribution stayed the same? Are people looking at different topics over time? Has the use of the higher end scenarios versus the lower end changed? As you pointed out, I mean, we kind of missed the fact that scenarios in the mitigation area are really focusing pretty much just on SSB2, and that may or may not have been happening early. That's something we didn't look at first time around, so if it was, we missed it. And so I'm wondering, do you and the team plan to publish a paper on it, right? Because you could have the method and the basic results, but then throw in looking at some of these kinds of trends over time.
Yes, I think is the short answer. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think it is really interesting. I do think that there's, like you're saying, that there's this shift in this version, and I've only done preliminary looks at this, but there's less of a focus on emissions and energy than previously, and land use. I thought land use was particularly interesting than we saw before. But I think you could you can go year by year, and that's the aim for the publication would be that we would look at the overarching. So, yeah, thanks for joining, and thank you for that question.
Great. Well, good luck with completing it.
Thanks, and feel better. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, and I don't see any hands for one last question here in the room, then thanks, Carol.
Thank you all, yeah.
So then we move on to Vanessa Schweitzer. And I have to say that I'm a little bit handicapped because I left my materials somewhere in this building. So don't have the program that well by myself. Something is not. I don't have a mouse here to work with, so it's a bit hard to open the file. Although, okay. Good old shortcuts are doing it, I think. Oh, yes. Right. Yeah. Okay. Good. So, Vanessa Schweitzer from the University of Waterloo on the limits to adaptation and reasons for concern. Contextualize the guidance on baseline scenarios for IV use. That's quite a mouthful there. Yes, that's right. Sorry.
Okay, thanks a lot, Boss, for the introduction. I'm at the University of Waterloo in Canada. I work in the Department of Knowledge Integration, and I also am currently a steering committee member on ICONICS, where we look after the SSPs. And I was approached by a collaborator, Colin Mahoney, from the Ministry of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development in British Columbia. And basically this, what I'm presenting is sort of the outcomes of discussion in terms of me learning more about how scenario users sometimes misunderstand what we're trying to do with the SSPs, and also how Colin is an example of an adaptation planner who was actually quite frustrated with the fact that high emission scenarios are really overrepresented in the impact, adaptation, and vulnerability literature. So these are just some simple counts with respect to how often you see the references to different RCPs and SSPs in the 5th assessment report as well as the 6th assessment report, and specifically the Working Group 2 contributions. And part of why he's frustrated is because as somebody who works in forestry, he is seeing a framing effect of these high emission scenarios with respect to what adaptation options are considered by adaptation planners or not considered. So this is an example of a very recent paper that just came out by Anderegg and colleagues where they were looking at U.S. forests. And you can just see from the visual alone, where this particular visual is representative of other visuals that were in the paper, a scenario like SSP2 4.5 does not look like a high emission scenario. But the confusion runs even deeper than that, because if you look at what it is that these authors have to say about their conclusions that they're drawing from these SSPs, I actually want to read this to you. First, they recognize substantial differences between high and low emissions SSPs. So bear in mind they're seeing SSP2 4.5 as a low emissions SSP. So they then say that there's a critical importance of climate policy to mitigate climate risk to U.S. forests. Then they give us a little bit of detail about further analysis that they did. And then they, again, return to interpreting a graph like this, and they say these risks are substantially mitigated by emissions reductions, SSP2 4.5. So there is still a confusion that for the mitigation community, right, the integrated assessment modelers, SSP2 4.5 is understood as another one of the baselines, but that's not necessarily translating to some members of the IAV community. So when Colin and I were talking about these scenarios and sort of the confusion around why are some scenario researchers, especially in Working Group 2, really fixated on those very high emission scenarios. And then we got into a discussion about business as usual scenarios. And again, if you are working as an adaptation planner, for instance, and you're trying to lay out for a decision maker which particular adaptation options are worthwhile to pursue. You're very interested actually in what your business as usual scenario ought to be. But I think what we're sort of observing right now is that there was sort of a historical legacy with respect to which scenarios were considered business as usual, where before Copenhagen, what we were really trying to do with some of our high emission scenarios was characterize dangerous climate change, where one of the questions was, what level of global warming is technically feasible if you just decide to ignore climate change as a problem? So those quote-unquote no policy sort of baselines from the SRES, that's where like the A1 fossil intensive scenario would be an example of that kind of scenario. And arguably SSP5 is basically the latest rendition of that kind of future. But now we're living in a world where there is a Paris Agreement, and so the question should shift instead to what are acceptable and tolerable levels of climate change. And so this is where it makes perfect sense to me that in the mitigation community, SSP2 would be the quote-unquote business as usual scenario that might be getting a lot of attention. But nevertheless, SSP3 and SSP4 would also be relevant baselines to consider, because the policy relevant questions moving forward are whether or not we maintain long-term commitments to something like the Paris Agreement, as well as what our level of ambition is, especially across countries. So the debate right now around RCP 8.5, again, shifting back to how it is that the IAV community tends to talk about it, it is centered around plausibility and likelihood. So there was a commentary from Hausfather and Peters, which was actually pretty informative. That's what Colin was telling me, that he really appreciated a paper like this one. And so that's where Hausfather and Peters did try to correct that RCP 8.5 is often misinterpreted. But there was also a recognition that when there was not clear guidance coming from those of us who are like looking after the SSPs and whatnot, that is where users will assign probabilities themselves, especially if they're working within the context where they're trying to identify expected value of different options. And so in terms of us thinking about improving the process, how can we better support the different users, since they do have different needs for how they are actually using these scenarios. So this is, a continued discussion, continued contemporary debate around whether or not RCP 8.5 is truly plausible, truly likely. But this is arguably a very old question, where I've flashed on the screen some of the, questions that go all the way back to, the beginning of the 21st century with respect to whether or not we could provide likelihood estimates for climate change. So in terms of trying to come up with some fresh ideas for how might we start to give better guidance to especially people in the IAV community for which SSPs they should be focusing on, and why maybe it's not so useful to include those high emission scenarios or be focused so much on those. And part of why you don't necessarily want to focus on the really high emission scenarios, and why Colin reached out to me, is because the SSP 8.5 scenario is largely beyond the coping capacity for adaptation. What he was describing to me was really what might help is kind of like reorienting the adaptation researchers back to what are the kinds of SSPs that actually describe an area where you have some hope for succeeding in adapting. And so this is a conceptual diagram that's being shown on the slide. The actual shape of where is the blue curve, and if you're wondering what the heck is going on with the gray curve is basically showing that if we take less ambitious positions towards mitigation policy, basically set goals that are easy to achieve for mitigation, you are sort of increasing the likelihood of having those higher emissions scenarios, but then sort of that trade-off, right, of like taking what's the easier path for success in mitigation policy, you're sort of setting yourself up for a much harder path in terms of succeeding on adaptation policy. So since IAV is not a monolithic group, that's where reasons for concern actually might provide some helpful guidance on what the shape of this trade-off between expectation of mitigation policy success and expectation of adaptation policy success might be. So I know this is like an out-of-date figure by now, but nevertheless, when we grabbed it, it still was serving that purpose of how you could look at different levels of climate change, also how reasons for concern is very useful to sort of like isolate the specific contexts in which adaptation planning, in which different adaptation planning would have to happen. And that's where you could potentially use those reasons for concern to sort of develop a shape or a conceptual shape of which RCPs and SSPs are relevant for different adaptation planners to focus on in their decision analyses, but then also possibly being this whole concept of expectations of success, and how really mitigation policy and adaptation policy ought to be the two communities ought to be seeing each other as teammates, right, in trying to figure out how to quote unquote live with climate change. So perhaps this is a new idea that can maybe help bring those two communities together and sort of understand how they can help each other out to come up with the best climate policies. But then through this sort of exploration, thank you. Through this exploration, one of the provocative questions is whether scenarios like SSP 8.5, if they actually are not so useful to include in the set of SSPs, or like because I completely agree, we should have multiple scenarios, and we do need to communicate to users they should be using multiple scenarios. But in working with Colin, this has sort of like provoked the question of, let's make sure that we are giving bundles of scenarios to the users that are actually useful. And so SSP 8.5 is useful for some of the other working groups, but for particular applications that are arguably niche applications. So this is something for us to consider, right, moving forward. And so naturally, to figure out if this is a good proposal, we should have more direct dialogue with IAV users on whether or not this would be helpful to maybe not have SSP 8.5 or very high-end scenarios like this be part of the set that they see. So that's just a written summary of everything that you heard. And so I've really been heartened to hear at this particular scenarios forum that there's sort of an openness to revisiting how we currently have scenarios showing up in the different assessment reports. I look forward to answering any questions or comments that you all have.
I actually would want to first then also immediately have indeed Claudia's presentation, and then we have a discussion about this topic in a bit more broadly.
Thank you, Bas. While you put up my talk, I want to say that I feel a little bit funny giving this talk now because I was at the session about integrated scenarios earlier, and I saw all the great work that is going on about putting climate impacts in scenarios. And here I am giving a talk where there is no work going on at all. It's just thoughts. And I'm wondering if it's a sign of age that Brian and I are at the point where we actually don't do any work anymore. we just sit around in front of our video cameras and try to think about stuff. So I hope this is useful just to give you a little bit of an abstract sense of how we thought about the problem. And so this is work with Brian, who is online. We are both at the Joint Global Change Research Institute, and so we work with GCAM. So we actually started thinking about this specifically for including climate impacts in the baseline reference scenarios of GCAM, but I hope our thoughts are of some use for the general point. So actually, first of all, we realized that we didn't even have a clear idea of what we mean by reference scenarios, because, in theory, you can call a reference scenario any scenario that you use as, a point of comparison. But here you want to talk about, the community type of baseline scenario that we push out in the scientific research community. And that historically, as we all know, do I actually need to keep this on? I'm like, I have my ice cream here, and okay. So historically, they have not included climate impacts, right? And we want to start thinking, even if I know there is work already going on, of like the title says, why and which impacts we want to include and how. So the proposal is, okay, let's do this and start thinking about a bit of the framing. So the general idea is this is what we have right now, based on the SSP narratives, quantitative elements, the production of IAMs, and then we want to possibly include, when we deliver these scenarios to the community, impacts. And impacts can be, of course, as we know, of many, many types. There are some cute icons there, but let's go on and start thinking of why we do this. And we think that there are several reasons that, of course, then create different motivations for including some impacts or not. And so, of course, one is to step toward what we were doing this morning, what we were listening to, and a step toward creating these integrated scenarios as reference scenarios. So scenarios that include all these outcomes that are of relevance to the world. They don't stop before doing that. One other reason is to instead give more plausibility to the emissions pathways that come out of our IAMs, because we may think that these climate impacts, of course, have feedbacks on the economy and therefore the emissions. And as we know, RCP 8.5 may be one of those that have failed to be plausible because of this lack of possibly feedbacks. Or we may want to provide some sort of baseline that includes some impacts for researchers to take those and go forward, add their own impact modeling, but that can be facilitated by what is already there. And a simple example is to include some form of biophysical impacts that then somebody takes and translates into metrics that have some relevance for well-being. The question then is, which impacts do you want to include? And of course, depending on your motivation, you may have different ideas. And again, if we are aiming for these integrated scenarios, then we really want to push it, as much as we can, include everything possible that we can, defensively model. Because we want to deliver a product that talks to well-being, both in terms of human well-being and ecosystem health. If we are only concerned about the plausibility of emissions and land use, then, like the next slide will show, the range of impacts that have been shown to have an actual significant impact, on emissions and land use is fairly small, and so we may not need to include a lot as an hard coupling within the IAM functioning. And if we want to foster further research, then the question is kind of open to the community. What kind of impacts would you want to have included in the package of those baseline scenarios that may help you with your work? And so that may be more of an open question. So I just want to mention this paper by Kaoru, which I think is in the next session, talking about the coupling of human and Earth systems, because they have this nice review paper that goes through the literature and tries to make sense of impact, size, and importance, specifically for the effect on emissions and land use. And so it's not a coincidence that he is not here, but he's in the session that is talking about actually coupling Earth systems with human system representation. And so from their ranking, if you call highly important an impact that has at least a 1% impact on GDP, then you're really limited to those first four impacts that I mentioned there. So that's why I'm saying, at least if we believe this literature review, which I do, maybe our job is not as overwhelming than if we want to include all sorts of impacts. So then in the last, I don't know how much time I have a whistle if you want to. But we try to somehow put up a graph that helps us decide how to go about actually modeling this. And of course we had GCAM and its own ecosystems of models in mind, but I think we made it general enough. So the idea, okay, we have our IAM, and it produces emissions and land use and all sorts of other already type of impacts, right? But the idea is that now we have climate information that either comes exogenously from, something, or it's actually climate information that is created consistently with the emissions that the IAM is producing, maybe even within the loop. And this climate information then contributes to, for example, guiding biophysical impact models or socioeconomic impact models that may in turn be driven by biophysical impact models. And then the output of these biophysical or socioeconomic impact models may feed back into the IAM, of course. And, the point is that the distinction here is that the biophysical impact models, as the name says, limit to, determine the impacts on the physical system, and the socioeconomic impact models are those that talk about well-being. And so one point that I want to make here is that if we take this up as a community service, let's say, rather than our own, modeling framework in-house, then the place from where these impact models come may be some kind of community effort that I write here is ISMIT, but of course I'm thinking of AGMIT and all the other efforts that are somewhat, concerted and organized and systematic and standardized ways to do impacts, to give some credibility and to have some, ranges of uncertainty and all that good stuff. And then, of course, if I think of my three motivations, you'll see that, if we are just concerned with, foster future research, we may stop at the biophysical outcomes, number one. If we are concerned with the emission and land use, we need this feedback loop that goes back to GCAM or our IAMs to actually influence the trajectory of emissions. And if instead we want these integrated scenarios, then we have to push it all the way to these socioeconomic outcomes that have much more relevance. And so the last slide I have is just a summary of what I said, to which, though, I want to add the point that is, of course, we want to keep also our baselines without impacts, in the sense that those will be valuable nonetheless. And so all this work shouldn't come, of course, at the cost of giving up our no impacts baseline scenarios. So that's all Brian and I, wanted to present. And thank you for your attention. I hope I stayed within a decent.
You stayed within the 2 minutes you negotiated extra for yourself.
Okay. Thank you. What do you do now?
Yeah, how about the two of you actually? Yeah. Or this is quite a broad topic, of course, and it echoes in quite a lot of presentations. One thing to mention that we were supposed to have actually also a plenary on this topic that I was supposed to give this morning. But you will now see tomorrow. But focusing more on the extremes of the ranges and how we deal with RCP 8.5 and updating that. So the discussion will continue. Let me not go and sort of summarize that talk at all. But it goes throughout the whole forum, luckily, what we do with these, especially the no policy baselines, whether those make sense as community scenarios, or whether we should indeed go to impact or policy scenarios that we hand over to other communities. Because we need the no policy baselines as a sort of a methodological step. And we said that originally in the SSP development, that we developed the SSPs without impacts and policies. But they're not the most useful scenarios actually to hand over maybe to working group 1 and to working group 2 and between 2 and 3, right? And so, that needs to be thought through again maybe. Good. I see 3 hands here. 4. Okay, good.
All together.
One quiet. Let's start.
Thank you both. Thank you both. That was really great. Well, I just wanted to go off of that a bit as well and say you both alluded to impact scenarios and having sort of additional scenarios built out. And Vanessa, you alluded also to having different pairings. And I wondered what would be the pairings that you would choose, or what levels would you like it to be at to be sort of these ideal packages that you could hand off? And do both of you have a sense of that, or how would that overlap?
I can answer the question for our own system. So GCAM uses an SSP2 as its baseline scenario. And so we are thinking about that as our starting point. And of course, the point is that if we're doing this for affecting the trajectory, right now what comes out of that SSP2 baseline scenario is about a 6 watts per meter square. So it would be an SSP2 6. Maybe we would affect some of that and change a little bit, but that's what we are thinking about, what we have to work with, let's say.
Yeah, and in my case, because I was, working with a scenario user, it was not really so much that he had like a good sense of like an alternative pairing. It was more that, I guess, it's almost like the scenarios you can choose from are not sufficiently well constrained. And so he felt like he was seeing a lot of his peers they were applying useless scenarios that you couldn't actually adapt to. And that was like where his frustration was stemming from. But we did have a little bit of I was asking him, well, what about SSP3 7, right? Like, he still felt like you can't adapt to that one either. So that was where, in terms of maybe trying to like redirect the attention of working group 2 to arguably it's going to be some like lower RCPs that you can actually adapt to, but then how did that sort of maybe change the conversation across the working groups in terms of what kind of advice we're giving to policymakers, instead of only talking maybe about like least cost mitigation, not just dollar signs least cost, but like let's also see from the reasons for concern, if you decide it's too expensive to save the coral reefs, right? Like what kind of, accept that, understand what kind of world is that, right? So I think that's more where my colleague was coming from.
Thanks. Yeah, for efficiency, let's actually take 3 here? Yeah, sorry. We have limited time in the end.
Okay. Yeah, Alex from PIC again. Thanks for the presentations, and I think looks better that way. You mentioned that you are kind of a bit late in the messaging that climate impact should be included in the scenarios if you've been to the other sessions and things are going on. But I think it's still a valid aspect because even if we have included the impacts at the moment, I mean, if I refer correctly back to the SSP times in 2017, a bit of time ago, one of the reasons why we didn't have the climate impacts in, I mean, was that we don't paint the full picture in terms of climate change, not in the sectors and even not across the sectors and not even within the sectors. And I think the same still holds true. I mean, we're having now whatever kind of impacts in, but it's not the full picture, and I think we still have to go towards painting the picture in even broader colors than in the end.
I like this type of question, so please keep going on this. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I like both presentations. Thank you very much. I have a question for Claudia. It was very clear and transparent and very honest. Thank you very much. Well, it's clear how you could go on the which impacts to create a dialogue with the IAV community, for example, and ask for a tool, a selection of basket of extra quantifications. I wanted to have your thoughts on the how. So do you see any space in that nice architecture of GCAM and, for example, participatory approaches in the process and more bottom-up type of methods that can be useful and that can come now with the database, for example, from Carol or ours? We might have some insights that cannot be captured by using the integrated assessment model. So I wanted to have a bit of thoughts from your side on this one. Because you talk with each other here in the IAV community.
You know, I'm not an impact person, and so I'm not good at answering that. I know that, I feel like the participatory bottom-up approach, I see it a little bit as in the climate model community where you have your big global models, but then you have to parameterize them, and to parameterize them, you conduct, field studies, or you have very, very fine-scale models, and you exercise those, and then you try to summarize up to the scale of the global model to make it work better. So I don't know if I'm clear, but I feel like, the kind of results and information that come from the type of studies you're thinking about could inform the way we do impacts at the larger scale. But for the IAM world, I just feel like the kind of impacts we want to introduce, by definition, should be at a fairly coarse, large scale. And I cannot imagine. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so hi, Casper Kok, Wageningen University. So I actually have one remark. Maybe you don't have to react to it. It's in one question. It's a remark I'm going to make in the plenary, I hope, but I think by then everybody fell asleep. So I'll make it now. And that there's one thing. The more I look at the matrix of RCP SSP combinations, and the more I talk to local practitioners, the more there's a crying need to allow the impossible combinations. Whenever I am in a local case study, the first thing they want is to maximize climate change and to maximize possibilities to adapt and mitigate. So they want an RCP 8.5 SSP1 combination, at least not to be marked as impossible by the IPCC endorsed process. So I can't get anybody to use it anymore, because that's where the innovation happens. You have a maximum signal, and you need to have efforts. And it's possible at local level, because you can assume the whole world to do something else than your own case study. Okay, you pass it along. I still have a question, though. I look at Vanessa then.
Oh, sorry, you'd like a reaction.
Boss, do you want a reaction?
Or did you want to ask your question as well?
No, that's not the question. No.
Yeah, go ahead then.
So if I go on with it, so this was just a remark, maybe. So the question is, at the moment you look at more than one scenario, which we always advocate, so you get 3 or 4 or 5 scenarios, and you bring them policymakers, the first thing anybody will do is to pick the one they like. So whether or not it's an RCP5 something combination or anywhere where we are, it's not a risk, it's a certainty that they will pick the one they like. So there's much more beyond what you were saying on the specific cases, but it's a more general issue that we have, that when we bring a set to policymakers, they will misuse it by definition. And I wonder what your general thoughts are on how to counteract that, because I encounter it all the time. They cherry pick, and they shouldn't.
Yeah, well, that was where when I was saying the sort of the challenge with SSP5 8.5, and it also comes back to this question of whether or not we should actually be internalizing some feedbacks in that scenario. I think that for a lot of, at least my colleague, right, who's working in forestry, he was asking me, like, how does this SSP5 8.5 scenario work? Because, clearly I can see that, like, all the forests are on fire and, like, we can't really adapt to that. So how do you have this future of, well, but everybody's wealthy and et cetera, et cetera? Like, it just did not compute for him. And so I do think that it does make sense to say that we should develop these other truly integrated scenarios where you actually do have some feedback. But I guess I think that as long as we continue to kind of press back to the policymaker that they can't just place all of their chips on a single scenario and try to bring them back to the fact that they do need to hedge their bets, right? And so what kinds of decisions do they need to make to have some good hedging strategies instead of completely only investing in the single scenario that is their favorite scenario?
Thanks. Max Tavoni from the Halifax European Institute. Thanks, and these are great talks. I'm thinking not to complicate things even further, to think about more scenario from two camps, but if we include policies, and we should include policies, as decided already, and if we include impacts, and we should, for the various reasons, depending on what kind of depth we want to go, then we should also include adaptation and policies around those. Now, we are not seeing that now, and there's a bit of a risk then in running into a bit of a trap of this, emphasizing these catastrophic scenarios as being more recurrent, similarly to what we see now in Vanessa's presentations with the very high-end ones being the most likely ones and the most frequent ones. So I don't know how we can do that, and also bring in the working group 1. Because it's mostly working group 2, 3 discussion here, but a lot of that actually came from working group 1, working heavily on the RCP 8.5, and that also leading the way with the ripple effects.
Thanks. Let me take 2 more questions here before you respond.
Hi, Alex Ruane from Nassagis and AGNIP. So I have a question for each of you. I'll try to keep fast. The thing that I think was missing from this general discussion is tolerated risk levels, right? So it's not the idea that we're going to adapt entirely. It's what's the balance of adaptation and risk, between mitigation, adaptation, and risk. Where do those things overlap? And I think that also brings back to working group 1. We have to actually quantify some of those risks from a physical standpoint. So I wonder if you'll comment on tolerance of risk and whether a wealthier society can pool that risk in different ways than a poorer society, for example. That's the first question. And then Claudia, that diagram you showed is similar to something that actually I worked on with Abigail Snyder from PNNL. We have a figure kind of like that I'll try to send your way. But one of the interesting things is it's a loop. So is the plan to make that all endogenous and you iterate until you get a settled scenario, or is it iterative?
I was trying to, well, I don't have the slides. For the purpose of making all consistent, yes, ideally we would like to make the loop, and there was a dashed line that created the loop. So, yeah, but I think the question is it worth it, in the sense that before creating a loop and endogenizing everything and coupling everything, you have to figure out if this feedback really changed the picture enough. Again, related to your risk tolerance maybe. But yeah, thank you.
Oh, and I was just going to quickly comment that I think that's really the direction that from the collaboration that I did, I feel like that's where we need to go and bring the decision makers there, right? To have like a more fulsome understanding of what are the risks as a package. It's not just carbon prices and taxes and that kind of thing, where I feel like that's maybe where a lot of the discussion is right now. But so showing them the bigger risk bundle, I guess you could say, so that way we do start having more of a discussion around tolerance instead of how currently there's still sort of this notion of, if we're talking about adaptation, we have to imagine what's the worst possible. Can we adapt to that? But we already know that there is some There's some commitment to trying to have an energy transition. There's also some commitment to doing some adaptation, presumably in some contexts. And so maybe it's if we identify what's the floor in terms of where we feel like it's unlikely that we're going to backtrack from those things, and maybe use that to sort of figure out what the new baselines with some basic feedbacks in there might look like.
All right. Hi, my name is Garrett. I'm from the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy, and I'm a GChem user, which you mentioned earlier. And I think these very hard science, high-level climate models, probably touch on kind of these ecological feedback loops that occur. But when you're talking about impacts and maybe from more of the IAM perspective, a lot of the ways that you talk about integrating them, and maybe this is just kind of my young and layman understanding of it, is just X happens, so Y happens, and here's the kind of the economic impact. And I'm curious how, well, not necessarily economic, you obviously talk about having a wider scope there, but I'm curious about how, beyond even just ecological, how those feedbacks turn into feedback loops, and how we talk about one, looking at that from a computational standpoint, where it's is this feedback loop just going to ruin the model because it just, it gets into a cycle, and two, just how do we talk about, the feedback loops that might matter and should be integrated at a baseline versus those that shouldn't be? I hope that question made some sense.
Thanks. I have here one more before you jump in.
Hi, I'm Eden Benveniste. I'm a postdoc at Harvard. I guess I had a question for you. People have been talking a lot about risk and tolerance, and since it's not that scientists won't give probabilities to whichever scenario, it's that you just can't. So I was wondering, in your conversations with practitioners, how can they envision, how do they work with the idea that you just cannot attribute probability to those things, and how do you make decisions based on that? I know you cited the article by Hausfather and Peters, who said people are going to attribute probabilities nonetheless. Is there a world where policymakers realize that you cannot do that and still just do robust decision-making without, tanking to the need to attribute whichever probability, which would be wrong based on that?
Go ahead, then we.
All right. So I'll start with the last question that I heard, and so that's where I completely agree that I said to my colleague, okay, this is decision analysis 101, right? Part of why you don't have probabilities is because it's a choice, right? And so when you are trying to decide across actions, right? There's no probability that's assigned to that, and then a chance node shows up somewhere else where it's weather is used as the perfect example of when do you do assign probabilities. So in terms of saying what is maybe the research, right, that needs to be done in terms of risk communication, and also maybe getting all of our different working groups kind of on the same page. I'm wondering if some of the robust decision-making, which you referred to, that's being developed by the deep uncertainty community, but even talking about how does it make sense to bring together Bayesian perspectives on alternatives and the Bayesian and frequentist perspectives on understanding probabilities, how do they change depending on which choice we make first. That I haven't fully fleshed out what those ideas are, but I agree with you that there is currently amongst some of the folks contributing to the impacts conversation, they want to just identify what's the frequentist probability that we need when they're missing the whole point that you can't really answer that question unless you know what sort of path you put yourself on. And I don't remember, was the other question also kind of related to? Yeah, okay. And so I'll turn it over to Claudia to answer the other question.
Yeah.
Eating up the
we
time
have
of
a question from Brian, and then we should go to the last speaker.
I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question, to be honest, but we can talk about it because we are. I think, one interesting issue with all this is that this stuff has a lot of uncertainties, and so we have to figure out how we deal with that, what we choose as our best estimate for this run. Do we do more than one? And so there is that, which is really interesting. There is the fact that, yes, we draw these lines and arrows, but then when we implement it, maybe we break something, but that's the life of modeling, I think, and it happens in every type of modeling. And in terms of the feedback loop, going completely awry and taking off in a weird direction, it would have to be a really, really strong feedback to do that. And what we see so far, it's not as strong, but maybe when we start putting in, I don't know, wildfires, maybe it could be. So it's all to be seen.
Okay, while we switch to Brian, let me inject one question for myself then. How do you think that we can make progress on this? Are we at the point where we could start writing sort of an overview assessment paper of what the different options are, and are there enough experiments to learn from, or are we still in the experimental phase where we should basically just encourage experiments so that we can learn from how to do this on the community level? Yeah, for the integrated.
Well, first of all, there is a lot of work already going on, so we are not going to set the agenda here, but I think to a certain level we would have to set an agenda in terms of, for example, that idea of easy MIP or whatever is associated with it, taking responsibility for, guiding the impact modeling in a way that is standardized and systematic and so on and so forth. And then my feeling is that we could start simple and then add stuff, and so even just implement, damage functions that are so different in the literature and see for a certain model what is the range of outcomes, and does it really matter or not, and that kind of stuff. So there are a lot of things to do, but I'm not here to set the agenda myself.
Okay. Brian?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not exactly sure if these are comments or questions. Maybe comments, I don't know. And there's two things I wanted to add. One is, Vanessa, I think your idea on using limits to adaptation as a way to frame, contextualize, kind of inform users about scenario choices is an interesting one. One caution about it, though, is that the concept of limits is a really soft and fuzzy one. And so that's going to be a challenge, right? So even like the results that you showed for the reasons for concern, which have limits taken into account in those purple areas, those are typically soft limits, right? So and in IPCC, soft limits mean things that are pretty hard to do right now without changing the way things work too much. They don't mean it's impossible. And so thinking about what we can or can't adapt to, even to very high warming levels toward the end of the century is pretty tough. I'm not sure we know all that much about it. The second thing is that on the reference scenario stuff, I mean, I was going to say just a reminder that what we're talking about here is community scenarios, right? Not an individual study or something. But I think it seems to me like everybody's got that, and that means if we want to go down this road, there's a lot to do, right? This means making a formal part of the SSP RCP process impact modeling, choosing, there's a wide range of uncertainty, so what do we actually put in a reference scenario, and how do we organize it, and who funds it, and how long is it going to take, and so on. So there's lots of stuff to do. I want to make one comment on a point that got raised earlier, is what about impacts that aren't in models, whether they're IAMs or impact models. And there, I just want to point out, I think we're talking about something different, which is a topic I talked about yesterday in a different session, which is integrated scenarios and putting storylines and quantitative results together at the assessment stage, where you kind of draw on all the evidence you have, including maybe some easy MIP runs or something like that, but drawing on qualitative studies and so on, and say, what is the story and some quantification about what the world looks like in a given scenario, an SSP2 4.5 or something like that. That, I think, is an assessment product, and something that we can and are, in some cases, working on putting together now from the current information we have, which is incomplete. And in the future, I think we can do much better at that by also taking a step toward it by putting a bunch of information in the reference scenarios to make those more useful. But those will be partly have answers in them as to what the world looks like, and partly they will be inputs to more studies to complete the picture. That's a little bit of a subtle distinction, but I think it's an important one of like, what do we want to put in reference scenarios versus what should our assessed product, our scenarios of all the outcomes when we put them together actually look like. So yes, I think that is more of a comment.
Thanks for that. I was just going to conclude that because then we can move on to the final speaker.
Yes.
Thank you for that, and thanks, Claudia and Vanessa. And now we have to see how this works with our last speaker who is online. Can she share her screen directly? And Jennifer Morris? That might make life easier.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, I'm here. I can share if that works.
I have to see whether it also works on our side. The technician is working hard in the back now.
Okay. Should I try to put it up, my slide?
Go ahead. Yeah, so far so good.
Does it work?
Yes, 10 minutes, and I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right. So, yeah, thanks for the great talk so far. And just as Claudia and Vanessa are worried about incorporating more realistic impacts into scenarios, I'm worried about incorporating more realistic policies and actions into scenarios. So I'm coming more out from like the mitigation side. And the work that I'm talking about is part of this paper that I've listed on the bottom here. It's called Future Energy in Search of the Scenario Reflecting Current and Future Pressures and Trends. So the motivation is that growing societal pressures, technology trends, and government and industry actions are moving the world toward decarbonization and away from what we have historically called business as usual. Business is changing. It's not staying as usual. There are a lot of drivers behind this, including climate change itself, as the impacts become increasingly noticeable. There's more demand for action in the form of activism, local and national interventions. There's changing technologies and markets, including financial markets. We're seeing a flux of company pledges, and all of these things are driving towards decarbonization. And as a result, the concept of as we've heard in these other talks, the concept of like a single, obvious business as usual scenario or a no policy reference scenario is no longer relevant. Instead, we really need to be exploring multiple plausible futures. We know this, right? What I see is a gap in the existing scenario space around. I have a lag here, I think. Sorry. Here we go. This question, what if the world continues to address climate change in the way it has so far, which is really through piecemeal actions, this kind of growing social and technological pressures? I think there's a dearth of scenarios that are reflecting these real-world types of policies, regulations, and actions, and importantly, how those might realistically evolve into the future. There's an over-reliance on carbon pricing and global coordination versus region, sector, and technology-specific regulations that we see actually being implemented. There's this I sense a hesitancy to make what might be considered arbitrary assumptions about future policy, but instead what we're left with is an abundance of idealistic global carbon pricing scenarios that many would argue are unrealistic. So how do we balance this? And there's a need to explore many different possible policy landscape evolutions, and to try to get at this idea of kind of a more realistic policy scenario, we do this in this work by considering a scenario that does not have globally coordinated mitigation efforts. We call this scenario the growing pressure scenario. And we really set out with these questions. What might we reasonably expect from future policy, technology, and social action? And where does that get us in terms of emissions and temperature? And then finally, what else would be needed to achieve more aggressive goals? So those are kind of these driving questions. So how we started was by a narrative like SSPs. A narrative in this case of the policies and actions we thought would be likely in the future, and then quantifying that storyline with specific timelines and targets that vary not only by sector but also by region. You can see here some of the things that we focused on, and there's region-specific timelines and targets related to things like renewables, coal, electricity, storage, refined oil phase out, and electric vehicles. I'm not going to go into all the details, just more of kind of how this type of scenario was developed. And so we quantify these types of targets, and we pass it through an integrated assessment model, in this case MIT IGSM model. And we look at the resulting emissions path, which again, I'm not going to go through all the details here, but the emissions path that results from our quantified storyline is one that nears net zero CO2 emissions by 2130. Another point to note is that we extended the scenario time frame out to 2150. So we're looking at a longer time horizon. So it's a more gradual emission reduction scenario. This type of approach, we also implemented the different elements of the scenario sequentially, so we could see the impact of the different components. We can see things like the falling cost of renewables, which is here, the orange line, and storage in the dashed blue line, have little impact on emissions when there's no policy covering other sectors, of course, due to the rebound effect. More fossil use is picked up in other sectors. Cleaning the electricity sector alone, which is this first four set of elements here, has a relatively small impact on the overall decarbonization. If you start electrifying energy-intensive industries, you can get more reductions. But here you can see this big drop. The most important driver that we've found is reducing refined oil demand, which of course is due to the pervasive use of oil throughout the global economy, but of course an essential element. We also find that global non-CO2 greenhouse gas emission reductions are essential. This bottom red line here, while CO2 emissions may hit near zero earlier in the time period, if you don't start addressing the other greenhouse gas emissions, GHG emissions will linger at about 30 gigatons of CO2 in this case. We can also look at things like the global primary energy and electricity mix. And in this type of scenario, you see fossil use, which is the bottom three colors here, generally growing and then starting this gradual decline after 2060. And being replaced by oil alternative, which is some combination of biofuels, electricity, and hydrogen, which is growing beyond that point, driven by massive electrification and expansive renewable energy. In terms of electricity generation, we see a faster decarbonization of the electric sector, but we still see growing natural gas out through, 2065 or so before it starts declining and becoming virtually close to zero emissions by about 2100. This type of scenario, run through our climate models, we find resulting in a stabilization at about 2.8 degrees Celsius in 2150. By 2100, it's still continuing to rise a little bit before it's stabilizing. And this, of course, is significantly lower than those historical, no policy reference scenarios, the SSP5, 8.5 type scenarios, which by our models we estimate about 5.3, which we don't think is realistic. But of course, they're higher than the Paris. This type of scenario results in a temperature higher than the Paris goals. But at the same time, scenarios like these can help provide a roadmap of what you would need to do differently to try to get closer to these goals. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty in the assumptions behind the policies in a scenario like this. One avenue is to do some sensitivity, which we did here around the phase out of refined oil, the electrification of energy-intensive industry, and what's going on in developing countries or regions such as Africa and India, which of course results in differences in the emissions and the resulting temperature. We did also look at uncertainty in the climate. So for a given emissions pathway, what's the uncertainty in the climate system itself drives uncertainty in the overall temperature, which again here you can see a range here, and is a reminder that once you're accounting for the uncertainty in climate, you're going to have to continually adjust your emissions pathway if you want to be sure you're going to hit a certain temperature target. So just to wrap up here, I think I have a few seconds left. Given the prevalence in the literature of no policy, business as usual scenarios, as well as idealized global carbon pricing scenarios, this work contributes an alternative type of scenario that considers current and future pressures and trends, which we really hope will foster important discussion around the challenge of building more realistic scenarios. It can provide a roadmap of how to get even further. We can see in this type of study the key role of oil in decarbonizing oil uses, and the need to step up actions beyond what we've modeled here. More generally, there's this need, I see a need to model more on-the-ground types of policies in our scenarios beyond carbon pricing, and more realistic future policy evolutions that don't automatically assume the world is going to cooperate in a perfectly harmonized way. So with that, I will end and look forward to discussion, and thank the other speakers for this session.
Thank you. And while I see some hands being raised here already, let me inject one thing based on what you hear present and the discussion we just had. Is basically, and not to solve here because it's going to be a very long discussion, is whether a community scenarios framework should consist of the most realistic scenarios that we hand over between the different communities that include everything that can be learned from that community. So all of the mitigation and policies, all of the impacts, and you hand over this fully integrated, realistic scenario to another community. Or should we, in a communities framework, be providing the building blocks for people to actually do that integration themselves?
Because that's on one of my slides as well. The one thing that I hear from the sub-global SSP users is they want the scenarios to be more realistic. I have a very clear answer, very clear comes out from the community. They want something with impact and they want something with policies. It's absolutely clear.
But that makes things really complicated. So.
Ted Shepard, University of Reading. It makes a lot of sense, but then you fan out all your temperatures by climate sensitivity at the end, which seems to me not consistent with your whole thinking, because surely if climate sensitivity is high, the pressure will be higher. Why don't you somehow fold that in?
I think that's a great point, and I think that's where we'd like to go. I think that's the goal of moving towards more integrated scenarios, and you can imagine kind of the feedback loop that Claudia was showing being in the model itself. Here, we used kind of climate change impacts as a motivator to kind of think about what types of policies we expect in the future, but we don't have the actual impacts in the model and a feedback loop to drive the action. I think that's where things should be headed, and that's kind of the ideal goal of the integrated scenarios. But until we have them, in the meantime, I think a scenario like this that's kind of trying to think through what might be more realistic in terms of human actions is a useful addition to the scenario space.
Hi, this is Justin Johnson from the University of Minnesota. First off, thanks for the tour de force of awesome. That was great. My question is one about framing. And so while I completely agree with the importance of including realistic policies into what we regard as a business as usual, I'm just thinking about one particular user community, and that would be like activists, World Wildlife Fund, Nature Conservancy types like this. In working with them, I found that to them, a business as usual really is used as a lack of ambition type of scenario. And so, while you're correct that it's probably not a business as usual, because we certainly will do something, it seems like it could still be useful to have some scenario that is still in the mix that represents that lack of ambition, even if it is the less plausible one. And I was just wondering, A, if you have any thoughts on that or reflections.
I completely agree. I think there's still a role for scenarios that, include basically a failure of society to act. That still is a risk. Whether it's more or less realistic is a question. I think there's a need for a kind of a scenario like the one I showed. And on the point of activism, it was one of the biggest challenges in framing this type of work, and for us was how to frame it without making it seem like we're suggesting it's a scenario of what's like bound to happen if we do nothing. Because this scenario is not a world in which we do nothing. There's a lot of action behind it. But it's actions that we see as being plausible and plausibly being implemented. But we didn't want it to be interpreted from the activism side of, you can't just tell the world this scenario is going to happen no matter, this is our business as usual, because then we're going to think we don't need to do anything, right? There's that balance too. So the framing was a challenge on that piece as well.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm a national modelist, so I'm not on the global level. And some reflections from my point of view. You're talking about actions and that you should model them. And I think we who model on the national model, we have been doing this for quite a long time. So maybe come and visit and review our studies and talk together.
Can I have one more question and then a short answer?
I hope it is open to a short answer. Lara Pereira, Global Change Institute at Wits University in South Africa. I think what you presented is a really great thought experiment, and we should be working through all of these. But I get really frustrated with this idea of realistic and plausible, as you said, and it's not because I think that we should be doing more plausible things. I think it's because if the society in 2150 is still organized in the same way as it is now, based on kind of the energy structures, then I think we haven't looked 50 years behind us, let alone 150 years behind us. And so I think it's a really interesting way to think through different kinds of things. Just, again, when we start saying Africa does X, but India does specific things, or other individual countries. If you just go vaguely down there, South Africa keeps on doing what it is, we're going to have a pretty bad problem on the continent. Biofuels was a big part of the mix. We're talking about feedback loops, where are these coming from? I think, going back to that integrated idea that this is a great thought experiment to maybe then say, okay, but then these will have the following implications in other areas. And so I think that it's a really useful thing, but I just want a lot of caution when we start using these words around realistic, around plausible, around, that because, I think we all need to be a little bit more critical and reflexive of how we're using these terms in this field. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, some reactions. Absolutely on the national modeling. We do national modeling as well, which we try to get, very on the ground type policies in there. I think bringing it up though to the global scale and how it's interacting with what's going on in other countries and the global picture, passing through emissions to temperature impacts, is less done, right? And to the second question, I agree. I think the ideas of realistic and plausible are very fuzzy. But at the same time, we can't just pretend that it's likely that the world is going to do nothing. And that's our main scenario of comparison. Or on the other hand, we have no problem assuming global coordination starting in 2020 or 2025 or even 2030 in the next 10 years, global harmonized carbon pricing at $1,000 per ton in order to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 and 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if we just let scenarios like those dominate the space, I think we're really missing a whole chunk of likely futures that isn't as idealistic or optimistic, and in my opinion is more realistic if we don't have a world like that. But again, it is a fuzzy concept, and we do need to be critical, but I do think that there's an area of the scenario space that is being neglected, and I think it's a challenge, and we put this forward as in the hopes to raise discussions about how we might confront that challenge.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the good discussion and presentations here. Before we end, one round. Before we end, one more logistical announcement actually to make is that because the plenary did not happen, of course, this morning, we have at 6:15 after the next parallel sessions, we continue in the theater with the plenary from this morning, but just with two speakers. We go for 1 hour, 6:15 to 7:15, before we then have the dinner outside here. And my plenary talk then goes tomorrow. And? Yeah, that's true. If you don't go to the plenary, then we assume that you have gone home. Yes. Okay, thank you.
Hetzelfde woord op de sheet op staan. Realistisch. What is realistic? What is plausible?